UPA versus Soviets, the untold story of the UPA. What makes people choose the forest over freedom? Why would thousands of men and women risk everything, against Nazis, against Stalin, against the odds? How did a ragtag army of farmers, escapees, and revolutionaries become the nightmare of the Soviet Union? This isn't just history, it's a thriller of forests, spies, assassinations, and the stubborn dream of freedom. Stay with me until the end, because the grand finale will reveal how the UPA lost the battlefield but won the war of memory. Picture Western Ukraine in the early 1940s, a land squeezed between two very unfriendly neighbors. On one side, Hitler's Germany, busy annexing, conscripting, and terrorizing. On the other, Stalin's Soviet Union, equally enthusiastic about collectivization, deportations, and crushing dissent. Into this chaos stepped the Ukrainian nationalists, who had been dreaming of independence since the 1930s. Their logic was simple and a bit cheeky. If the Nazis and Soviets punch each other long enough, maybe we can sneak in and declare independence while they're catching their breath. Thus, in 1942, the UPA was born, a ragtag underground army made up of cadre revolutionaries who had been plotting independence since forever, escaped conscripts who didn't fancy working in German factories, former Red Army soldiers who decided, why not fight for Ukraine instead? Mobilized peasants who were basically told, congratulations, you're now a partisan. By March 1943, even Ukrainian auxiliary police units deserted the Germans and joined the insurgents. Voila, the UPA was now a full-fledged underground army. By summer 1944, the UPA had swelled to about 100,000 fighters. Impressive, right? Except they were fighting, well, everyone. Against the Germans, sabotage, ambushes, and cutting communication lines. Against Polish partisans who wanted Western Ukraine back under Polish control. Against the Soviets, who sent partisans and Red Army units to squash them. It was like being stuck in a bar fight where every drunk guy thinks you insulted his mother. In Volhynia, 60% of UPA units were destroyed or scattered. Galicia fared slightly better, but still lost 40%. Yet, like weeds in a garden, the UPA kept sprouting back. Young Ukrainians kept joining under the motto, freedom for Ukraine, or die trying. Stalin, never one for subtlety, decided to deal with the UPA using brute force. Enter the large blockade of 1946. 400,000 Red Army soldiers, border guards, and internal troops surrounded forests and villages. The idea? Starve the insurgents out, freeze them, or force them to surrender. Result, about 40% of UPA personnel were wiped out. Those who survived either deserted, surrendered, or kept fighting in smaller, scattered groups. But Stalin wasn't done. He added famine, 1946-47, and mass deportations, 1947. 500,000 Ukrainians, 8% of the Western population, were killed, sent to labor camps, or exiled to Siberia. 1947 became known as the Year of Dread. Realizing they couldn't win large battles, the UPA shifted tactics. Units shrank to 50 men, then to 10-man squads. They became shadows in the forests, striking quickly and vanishing. Their hope? That a war between the USSR and the West, especially during the Korean War, would give them a chance to rise again. Spoiler alert, that war never came. Nuclear weapons made sure nobody wanted to play World War III. So the UPA kept the flame alive, not to win outright, but to symbolize resistance. Their leaders believed, if we can't topple the Soviets, at least we'll keep the banner of independence flying until someone else can. Loving the story? Be generous. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next chapter. Why did so many Ukrainians take to the woods instead of rotting in Soviet prisons or being executed? Simple. Because the forests were freedom. Because the forests were family. Because the forests were the last place where the Soviet regime couldn't immediately chain you to a collective farm or throw you into a gulag. Some joined to protect relatives already hiding there. Others joined because they had no future in Stalin's glorious social structure. And many joined simply because they were done with abuse, deportations, and famine. In short, the woods were safer than the system. The commanders of the UPA weren't just motivated, they were obsessed. Their mission was crystal clear. Keep the flame of independence alive, harass the Soviets until the regime cracked, prepare for the day when a national uprising could finally explode. But the Soviets weren't stupid. They knew the danger wasn't just the guns, it was the idea. The longer the Ukrainian national idea survived, the more people it could attract. And that terrified Moscow more than bullets ever could. Fast forward to Munich, October 1959. The KGB had a problem. Stepan Bandera, the fiery leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, was still alive, still inspiring, still dangerous. Solution? Eliminate him. So they sent an agent with a weapon straight out of a spy novel, a cyanide gas gun. One shot, one puff, and Bandera collapsed in the stairwell of his Munich apartment building. Dead. Why kill him? To deprive the movement of its banner, to sow division among Ukrainian factions, to make them blame each other for betrayal. And it worked, because for 2 years nobody knew who had done it. The movement was paralyzed by suspicion, arguments, and paranoia. Exactly what the Soviets wanted. The Soviets didn't just fight the UPA with soldiers, they fought with insidious tricks. Militant agents were recruited by blackmail or threats. They were ordered to kill their own commanders at dawn, then scream, "The commander is dead," to spread panic. Provocateur squads dressed in UPA uniforms and committed atrocities, so villagers would hate the insurgents. Explosives and poison were slipped into camps to wipe out leaders. Compromising documents were planted to make the UPA's own security service look corrupt. And the recruitment machine was massive. Tens of thousands of agents were created by exploiting the infamous law of spikelets, 1932, which meant you could get 10 years in prison for stealing even a single nail or a handful of grain. The choice was simple: snitch or rot in jail. In 1950, the UPA's legendary commander Roman Shukhevych was killed. That was the turning point. Without him, the movement lost its backbone. From then on, the UPA shifted from full-scale resistance to propaganda, sabotage, and survival. By the early 1950s, there were probably more fake UPA squads run by Soviet provocateurs than real ones. The underground was collapsing under the weight of betrayal, infiltration, and exhaustion. Here's the twist. The Soviets weren't actually afraid of the UPA's guns. They had more soldiers, more tanks, more everything. What they feared was the idea, the stubborn belief in an independent Ukraine. Because ideas spread, ideas inspire, ideas survive even when armies die. And that was the true threat. So the Soviets made it their mission to crush the idea itself, through assassinations, deportations, propaganda, and terror. But the UPA, even in its dying breath, refused to let the banner fall. They fought, they sabotaged, they whispered the dream of freedom into the ears of the next generation. And that dream, though bloodied, battered, and poisoned, survived. By the late 1940s, the Soviet regime had perfected the art of manufacturing traitors. It wasn't just about recruiting a few spies, it was about creating an entire ecosystem of informants. Village informants. Ordinary peasants were forced to report who had visitors at night, who whispered suspicious things, who seemed too patriotic. Blackmail pipeline. Anyone caught stealing even a trivial item, grain, nails, or firewood, was threatened with 10 years in prison unless they agreed to inform. This law turned half the countryside into reluctant Soviet snitches. Sleeper agents. Some recruits were ordered to live quietly in villages for months, pretending to be loyal UPA sympathizers, only to betray entire cells when the time was right. By the early 1960s, the UPA was militarily broken, but the Soviets still couldn't sleep easy. Why? Because the movement had shifted underground into culture, memory, and identity. Families passed down stories of resistance like sacred heirlooms. Songs and poems carried coded messages of defiance. Even in exile, Ukrainian communities abroad kept the flame alive. The Soviets had won the battlefield, but they had lost the war of memory. And that was the ultimate irony. The UPA's greatest weapon wasn't its guns, but its ability to outlive the empire in spirit. So what do we have here? A people who chose forests over prisons. A movement that fought everywhere. On the battlefield, in the villages, in the shadows. A Soviet regime that unleashed spies, poison, fake squads, and famine to crush them. The assassination of Bandera in Munich, a Cold War murder straight out of a thriller. And finally, the realization that ideas, not weapons, were the true battlefield. The UPA may have been eliminated militarily, but their stubborn defiance planted seeds that would bloom decades later. The Soviets feared the idea. And in the end, it was the idea that outlived them. This isn't just history. It's a spy novel, a tragedy, and a testament to the power of belief. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more epic history adventures. Every follow helps build and grow this channel. See you in the next one.